Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Hello and welcome back to Safeguarding Conversations. Today we're discussing the Crime and Policing Act 2026 and why it matters far beyond policing alone. A lot of media attention around the Act has focused on crime, antisocial behaviour and police powers. But actually, when you look more closely, this legislation has major implications for safeguarding, education, online safety, and the protection of children and vulnerable people. And joining me again is Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sam. Yeah, this is one of those pieces of legislation where the title can almost make people think, well, it only applies to policing professionals. But actually, the implications for schools, safeguarding teams, youth services, and community organisations are huge. You know, what really stands out is that the Act reflects a major shift in how government and safeguarding systems now understand harm. So we're moving away from seeing issues like exploitation, violence, online abuse, and organised crime as separate problems. Instead, the legislation increasingly recognises that these harms can overlap and often sit within the same safeguarding picture.
And that feels particularly important when we think about children and young people, doesn't it? Because many of the risks schools are dealing with now don't sit neatly in one category anymore. You know, a child could simultaneously be vulnerable to online grooming, criminal exploitation, coercion, violence, and harmful peer culture.
Absolutely. And the Act recognises that safeguarding can't simply be reactive anymore. There's a much stronger emphasis on earlier identification, really links in with the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Act, prevention and disruption before harm escalates. That links very closely to the wider direction we're seeing within draft Keeping Children Safe in Education 2026, particularly around predictive safeguarding, contextual safeguarding, and recognising harmful intent earlier.
Yeah, and I would say that focus, predictive safeguarding, is something that we really are going to have to direct our focus to. One of the biggest developments in the legislation is the creation of a specific offence of child criminal exploitation, CCE. So, Sarah, maybe it's worth you just explaining to listeners why that's such a significant change.
Well, I think because for years, many exploited children were sort of still being viewed primarily through a behaviour or criminal lens rather than a safeguarding lens. The Act strengthens the understanding that children involved in county lines activity, drug transportation, theft, violence, or gang-related offending, may themselves be victims of grooming, coercion, and exploitation. And that's a very important shift because it changes the questions that professionals should ask. You know, instead of simply asking, what has this child done? Safeguarding professionals are increasingly expected to ask, what may have happened to this child, or who is controlling or exploiting them?
That's so key, isn't it? And linked to that is the new offence of cuckooing. That's where organised criminals take over the home of a vulnerable person to store drugs, deal drugs, or carry out criminal activity.
Yeah, and what's important is that the legislation recognises how criminal groups deliberately target vulnerability. So that might include, you know, it might involve adults with addictions, mental health difficulties, learning difficulties, isolation, or financial hardship. And for safeguarding professionals, it reinforces how exploitation affects not only children, but also vulnerable adults and entire communities.
And I think one of the most important sort of practical messages for schools is that many indicators of exploitation may initially look like behaviour concerns, you know, things like sudden aggression, repeated absences, unexplained money, changes in friendship groups, or going missing.
Absolutely. And the Act reinforces that these signs may represent safeguarding risk rather than simply poor behaviour choices. And that means that schools increasingly need those strong systems for recognising patterns, recording concerns, sharing information, and understanding the wider context around a child's behaviour.
Another major area within the legislation focuses on technology assisted abuse and artificial intelligence. And this is probably one of the most significant safeguarding developments we've seen in recent years, isn't it?
I think so too. The Act introduces new offences linked to AI generated child sexual abuse material, deep fake abuse imagery, and technology designed to facilitate sexual exploitation. And this is hugely important because the nature of abuse is changing rapidly. A child no longer has to directly send an explicit image for abuse to occur. Ordinary photographs taken from social media, school websites, or messaging platforms can now be manipulated using AI nudification tools to create entirely fake but highly realistic sexual images.
And I think many professionals are still catching up with how quickly this technology is developing, aren't they? What's particularly significant is that the legislation makes clear that synthetic or AI generated abuse imagery can still constitute criminal abuse material. And the offences extend to the creation, possession, sharing, and facilitation of this material. And importantly, the Act also targets the technology itself. It introduces offences connected to AI tools or systems specifically designed to create child sexual abuse material, often referred to by the acronym CSAM.
Definitely.
So, this isn't just about the images, it's also about the software, the guidance, and the systems enabling the abuse.
Exactly. The government is recognising that online abuse ecosystems now include forums, manuals, AI generators, and online communities sharing methods and tools designed to facilitate exploitation. And from a safeguarding perspective, this changes how organisations think about online harm. Abuse is no longer only about direct contact or direct image sharing. Technology itself has become part of the safeguarding risk landscape.
And this links closely to growing concerns around sextortion and financially motivated sexual extortion as well, particularly where children are manipulated into sharing images and then threatened, blackmailed, or coerced.
Yeah, and these forms of abuse are becoming increasingly organised, financially driven and internationally connected. And again, schools are often the first place where behavioural indicators emerge, that anxiety or withdrawal or panic around phones, self-harm risks, unexplained distress or sudden school avoidance.
The Act also strengthens measures linked to violence against women and girls. I mean, there's a stronger recognition of stalking, cyber stalking, misogynistic abuse, intimate image abuse, coercive communication, and online harassment. And again, technology is central here. The legislation increasingly recognises how digital environments can amplify abuse, control, and exploitation.
Yeah, it really does.
And another important area is mandatory reporting linked to child sexual abuse.
Yeah, and this is likely to have major implications for organisations working with children. So, schools, colleges, charities, sports organisations, and youth groups may all need to review their safeguarding policies, reporting pathways, and staff training. The overall direction is very clear. Safeguarding systems are expected to identify concerns earlier, respond more consistently, and strengthen accountability.
And when we step back and look at the bigger picture, this Act feels like part of a much wider cultural shift in safeguarding.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The legislation reflects growing recognition that safeguarding in 2026 has to be technology aware, it has to be trauma informed, and it has to be multi agency. Many of the harms addressed within the Act don't fit neatly into one service, as we said at the beginning, or one professional role. They require a coordinated response between education, police, health, social care, youth justice and community organisations.
And for schools specifically, it means, policies and staff training, they're going to need updating and they're going to need ongoing review.
Absolutely. I'm busy at the moment, Sam, updating all the policies in our library. Online safety policies, acceptable use agreements, child-on-child abuse procedures, safeguarding training and filtering and monitoring systems, they may all need revisiting. So staff awareness around AI-generated abuse, exploitation indicators, harmful online cultures and contextual safeguarding is becoming increasingly important.
And I think one of the strongest messages from this legislation is that safeguarding systems can no longer simply wait for clear evidence of serious harm before acting. The emphasis is increasingly on recognising vulnerability, disruption of harm, and earlier intervention. And ultimately, that's probably the biggest takeaway from the Crime and Policing Act. This is not simply a policing reform package. It reflects a much broader shift in how society understands exploitation, abuse, vulnerability, and public protection in an increasingly digital world. So thanks for joining us again on Safeguarding Conversations. We hope today's discussions helped unpack some of the key safeguarding implications emerging from the Crime and Police Act and, just why this legislation matters for schools, safeguarding professionals and wider communities. Thanks for listening.